All right, cool. So I guess thanks everyone for joining the third edition of the November seminar. Today we're very excited, to have Nina Bindel joining us to talk about post-quantum transitions of real-world protocols. So Nina is a researcher at Sandbox, located in Germany, actually. And before that, she's been affiliated to the Technische Universität Darmstadt as a postdoctoral researcher in the Cryptography group led by Mark Fischlin. Until early 2022, she was also affiliated to the Institute of Quantum Computing as a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Combinatorics and Optimization at the University of Waterloo. She's also been a research visitor at the Lattice program of the Simons Institute at UC Berkeley in spring 2020, and she interned at Microsoft Research Redmond during the summer of 2019. And before, she was a postdoctoral researcher in the cryptography and computer algebra group at TU Darmstadt, where she received her PhD in September 2018 under the supervision of Johannes Buchmann. I don't know if it's the right pronunciation, sorry, from TU Darmstadt. And we are really happy to have her. And now I guess the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, Buchmann is the correct pronunciation. Also, otherwise your pronunciation was on point, so no worries. Thank you very much for having me here. And hello, everyone. I'm very excited for this talk. I will start with telling you a little bit more, adding to the introduction, adding a little bit about myself and my career path before I then talk about research, giving a small introduction into post-quantum cryptography, making sure that everyone in the audience can follow me, and then I dive into one of my recent research papers. So I'm Nina, my pronouns are she and her. I am a full-time researcher at Sandbox, working on real-world protocols. And at the moment, I'm focusing very much on the passwordless authentication for FIDO2. And also recently, after a long time of research, the paper about vehicle-to-vehicle communication has been published recently. So I will use this as an example for one of the real-world protocols to exemplify kind of the challenges and solution and steps in the post-quantum migration. What I would also like to share is 3 book recommendations. The first one is a graphic novel, How the Internet Really Works. It's really fun to read. It's very accurate. So I enjoyed reading that and recommending that. Then another one is More Than a Glitch, which is a book that we have been reading at Sandbox in a reading group. And it's about discrimination, in particular racism, sexism, and ableism that is introduced in and through technology, so to say. So it's a very nice systematic collection summary by Meredith Brosand. And another one that's just my bedtime reading that I really enjoyed is Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other, which I thoroughly enjoyed and would like to recommend. As it was said before, I joined Sandbox earlier last year in July 2022, and I'm located in Germany. Sandbox is a fully remote company. You can see here where our full-time employees are hired. So we do focus on North America and Europe. And I just noticed that Alaska does belong to the US as well. However, we do not have full-time employees there, so I guess that's fair. How did I end up at Sandbox? So I started studying mathematics. I'm starting for this one. I started a little bit earlier in my career than I usually tell people. So I started studying mathematics at the Technische Universität in Kaiserslautern with a research stay in Oslo, which I very much enjoyed. And then I actually moved and joined Technische Universität of Darmstadt, where I did my PhD, doing which I also had different research stays in Canada and also New Zealand. Afterwards, I moved on to a little summer internship at Microsoft Research, and then started my postdoc as also being a short-term fellow at the Simons Institute. So what I really enjoyed in this, that I was able to spend time at very terrific places, but I also had the chance to work with fantastic people. And for this seminar, I went through the exercise of listing them and checking, okay, what's actually the ratio between female and male co-authors on my papers. And I have to say the disclaimer is that this is to the best of my knowledge how they identify. And so up to approximately 2022, my ratio was kind of good. So it was 34% of my co-authors were female, which is, I think, kind of good considering that 25% of women overall, that we have 25% of women overall in cybersecurity. However, and I guess that's the law of small numbers, I then joined a collaboration where I was the only female author within seven men, so that my ratio dropped to 28%. But yeah, feel free to write me. I have to get this ratio up again. And while I was doing this exercise, I actually looked, okay, what is the ratio overall in my papers, right? And so you can see here, the larger the circle, the more papers I have with this ratio of co-authors, so to say. And so you can see that I only have one single author paper. I do enjoy working in teams much more than I like working on my own. And you can also see that luckily that paper with the 7 men was an outlier here. And that usually I do like to work with other women. In particular, usually when I start a new research project, I usually try to also, when I select my co-authors, naturally, usually women end up as my co-authors. Usually the one where I'm the only woman, that's usually collaborations where I was invited to an existing team. And so how to choose collaborators and co-authors is actually one of the 3, I call them forwarded wisdoms, because there were wisdoms that were shared with me throughout my academic career that I found useful and would like to share. And so the first one is to surround yourself with people and co-authors that are respectful, that you can also learn from, and that are also fun to work with. And there are many opportunities, even if you're a very young researcher, I think there's so many collaboration opportunities that there's no need to sacrifice this, even just to work for one opportunity, let's say, to work with people with a lot of prestige or something. Another wisdom that I sometimes still have to remind myself if I'm the only woman speaking on a workshop or in a panel or on a PC, something. Luckily, that doesn't happen so often anymore. But then to remind yourself that nobody would ever hire or engage you in anything if you were not good enough, or if you were not good, right? So don't let people get into your head about that you are just there for the quota or that you're a token hire. You're there because you're good enough and you belong there. Always remember that. And the last one is something that my doctoral supervisor shared with me, that yes, it is important to search or to select the research visits, the destination for postdocs and things like that, also based on the people you want to work with. But also he said, just go to nice places. So this is something that I try to do. This is also, I work with Stephen Guivarth in New Zealand. Of course, I want to work with him, but also New Zealand is a very nice place to spend time in, for example. All right. So with that, I would like to lead over to the research part of my talk. So what I will do is to give a very quick introduction to post-quantum cryptography, what it is, what is the current status, why is it important? One thing ahead. So feel free to ask questions, and for the organizer, feel free to relay them. If this is needed for your understanding of the talk, I really want you to follow the talk. And then more general question, of course, I will take at the end for the questions and answers. All right. So as you all know, in our daily lives, we connect to numerous services, whether this is to connect to the seminar, or do online banking, or to access health data. We do that digitally, and usually these are secure connections, for example, using TLS, right? And while they are secure today, they won't be as soon as large quantum computers. They are also called cryptographically relevant quantum computers can be built. And the reason for that is that in 1997, Shor presented a polynomial time, so an efficient algorithm to solve the prime factorization and the discrete logarithm problems on such a quantum computer. And since our currently used asymmetric cryptography relies mostly on these 2 problems, you can use a large quantum computer to then recover the secret key info and decrypt, for example, RSA or discrete logarithm-based encryptions, which then might threaten the health, safety, and economic well-being of ordinary people, corporations, and governments. But now, of course, this is only a threat if such large quantum computers exist. So what is the current state of the art of quantum computers? And as far as I know, the last big update was in 2019 when Google showed quantum supremacy. I really dislike this term, but this is what you find in the literature. What it means is that they were the first one showing application where quantum computers were actually performing faster than classical computers. This is a little bit under, so some people doubt this. Some people say, no, if you speed up classical computers, then yeah, this would be also as fast. One of the main people doubting that are from the competitors IBM. So I don't know what the current state of this discussion is. And also there might still be quantum compute, or there might already be quantum computers that are larger. However, I did not put any other numbers here because today it's kind of complicated. There are many different kinds of quantum computers. Some are really tailored for the application, some are fault tolerant, some are not. And so there's a current report by the BSI, which is essentially the ministry or the Institute for Standardization in Germany, who put out a new report summarizing the state quite nice. And they are also citing from this paper here, where you can see the different kinds of quantum computers. And so concerning the state of the art of quantum computers, I will leave it at that for this talk. But I would like to put out some educated guesses. And so my co-authors and I, we computed some estimations or guesses what this means for cryptography and when we can expect such quantum computers. So a disclaimer is my co-authors and I, we are not quantum computing experts. We are cryptographers. And so we based our estimations on the three sources here. So one is IBM's roadmap for quantum computing. The other one is this paper, which analyzes how big quantum computers should be to break ECDSA. And the other one is based on experience, on like past deprecations by NIST, for example. And so what could be a potential timeline is that maybe in the early 2030s, there could be a quantum computer which would need, according to this paper, about 13 million qubits that can break ECDSA in one day. A little later could then be the quantum computer which can break ECDSA in 1 hour. And based on these, we estimate that maybe in the end of the 2030s, NIST might deprecate ECDSA. And then maybe in the mid or end 2040s, ECDSA might be disallowed by NIST. So again, these are educated guesses that we summarize in this paper about vehicle-to-vehicle communication that also the rest of my talk will be based on. What is something that we know, or is in the shorter future, is that NIST standards for post-quantum cryptography will be available. So NIST started in 2017. They started the standardization effort with the aim of standardizing digital signature schemes and key encapsulation mechanisms that are secure, even in the presence of quantum computers. And by now, after several rounds, the first drafts of the CAM-Kyber and the signature scheme dilithium are available. And we are waiting for drafts for two more signature schemes that are also selected, namely Falcon and Things. These names will come up throughout the talk a few times. Something that I started throughout the process is to start the second branch of standardization to diversify their portfolio of CAMs. So at the moment, only one CAM-Kyber is selected for standardization, but to have more diverse schemes available, they opened the second line to standardize alternate schemes. And with the same reasoning, earlier this year, they started another standardization effort just focused on digital signatures. All right, so that looks great. NIST is looking into that. We soon have standards. Also, I should say that other standardization agencies, of course, look into it. IETF, ETSI, also different government organizations are also very active in this field. There's also standardization efforts of South Korea and China, and also in Europe, for example, France, UK, and Germany. They are all very active in this field. However, as you can see how I built this up, it's not that easy. We still don't have plug and play solutions. And the reasons for this are kind of threefold. So one is that some of the schemes, in particular also for the new signature call, they're pretty new in their design. So we need more cryptanalysis. And until we have that, there is a lingering uncertainty about the security of these schemes. We also have, with these post-quantum schemes, we have efficiency drawbacks. So, for example, none of the signature schemes is as fast and has as small communication sizes as ECDSA, for example, which is challenging for many protocols. And also, we are still missing functionality. So we have either to work around this, or we just have to construct some of the functionality from post-quantum assumptions. On the other hand, there is this quantum threat against classical schemes, and there's kind of an urgency. And the urgency, in my opinion, comes from two arguments, from 2 points. So one is this attack, which is called store now, decrypt later attack, which means that, and we know that some governments are doing that they store the data that is now encrypted under these classical, under RSA, for example. They store them to then decrypt them as soon as these cryptographically relevant quantum computers are around. So the sooner we switch, the sooner we base our security on post-quantum, the less likely this attack can be done. And the other one is about authentication. So with authentication, digital signature schemes, one could say, well, we don't have to focus on this, as authentication is, for most of the times, it's in the present, right? You need this guarantee of integrity and authenticity, in the moment. But with authentication, it's often the sheer scale of things. So imagine that every ATM has to be updated, every machine in every store, every credit card reader has to be updated. So just the sheer scale makes this migration for authentication systems very hard. Also, when I think of examples like, for example, satellites or airplanes, these are just systems that you cannot easily upgrade. So whenever there's hardware involved, that cannot be upgraded easily, because once you shoot up the satellite in space, you're not getting it back easily. Then you also have to think of these longer timelines about what needs to be secure in 10, 15 years. And I will touch on this a little bit also with the vehicle-to-vehicle example, because there we have this situation that cars are around for 10, 15 years. And customers usually do not bring them back to be upgraded. One way to smoothen the transition and also to work against the first point, against the uncertainty about the security, are these hybrid schemes. And so in a hybrid scheme, you combine two algorithms of the same kind, for example, two signature scheme, one being post-quantum, the other RSA, for example, in a way that they are secure as long as at least one of them is secure. So that means you kind of increase your chances in this betting, right? That even if one is broken, your entire system is still secure. And this has been looked at for different applications already. So here you can see a selection for the hybrid signature. So that have looked at for certificates, for TLS, of course, for emails. Also, we looked into the passwordless authentication FIDO2, also vehicle-to-vehicle or aircraft. And as mentioned in this talk, I will focus on the vehicle-to-vehicle, and I will use it as an example to express to explain the challenges and solutions during this post-quantum migration. So first, I will explain to you what do I actually mean with vehicle-to-vehicle communication. I use this word, but you maybe don't really know what this is. Then present our partially hybrid design, and then also explain a little bit in more detail than usually people do, maybe how we evaluated this, how we ensure that this is actually a viable solution. But for now, I would like to give a second if anything is unclear regarding the post-quantum introduction. Just wanted to give a second for people to ask questions. All right, that's not the case. Then let's move on to vehicle-to-vehicle communication. So when I talk about V2V communication, then I'm talking about direct wireless communication to increase the situational awareness of the drivers. So for example, here in this little picture, you can see that these cars are approaching a hidden intersection. And so this vehicle-to-vehicle communication is used to then notify the driver, be careful, there's actually a car approaching this intersection. This is supposed to prevent many collisions, 600,000 collisions per year in the US alone, which might increase because these systems are implemented more and more in cars, and they might also serve as a base for autonomous driving. So it is kind of important that we are getting this right. The vehicle-to-vehicle communication is essentially based on two different standards. At the core, the two are very similar from the security protocol. However, their constraints are very different. And so our experimental evaluation will focus on the IEEE one. Just something that I mentioned before, this is the timeline you saw before, just to motivate why we are looking at vehicle-to-vehicle communication, since arguably this will not be the first target of a quantum attacker. But here's what I mentioned before, is that we just have such a long lifespan of the hardware that we already, and also upgrading these standards and so on, just takes a long time that we need to look into this already now. But selecting what protocol you should look at is kind of the first step in this migration, right? How do you decide what protocol is the most urgent one or the most important one to also upgrade? Where should you focus your research? And I would like to argue that it's important to look at the entire, at the urgency of the system, right? Really taking into account the lifespan of the hardware and not only the cryptographic guarantee of integrity, for example. All right. Going back to the protocol, at the core of the vehicle-to-vehicle communication are these basic safety messages, which are messages that are broadcast 10 times per second within the vehicle's transmission range, and it collects and broadcasts information like direction, speed, time, location, whether the car brakes or accelerates, things like that. And so how does the IEEE 16009.2 describe this security protocol? So assume we have a sender and a receiver. However, in practice, both of the cars are sending and receiving the entire time. And assume we have a sender who has a public secret key pair. The sender's car collects this information, stores this in the BSM, signs this using ECDSA, which you know by now is quantum vulnerable, and then sends the signature, the BSM, and the certificate, including the public key, to the receiver. The receiver can then extract the public key and use it to verify whether the signature is valid. If that's the case, the car will go on to process the BSM. Something that's important to point out here is that we actually need to communicate this certificate. So the receiver cannot download it from some database when it's at home or something, but it needs to be communicated on the fly. Since for privacy reasons, this public key is changed every 5 minutes. So the certificates are valid for an entire week, but throughout this week, every 5 minutes, the public key is changed. And so you need to communicate it to the cars in the transmission range. Technically, you need to, following this protocol, you need to transmit it with every BSM. In practice, however, it said that it's enough to transmit it every five messages, right? That means a delay of half a second is kind of acceptable. What we, in one part of our work, what we showed that actually even transmitting it every 5 messages is too much. In 99% of the cases, the peers around had the certificate and you do not to transmit it. And so what we also introduced is something that I will skim over here, but that I find interesting. Oh, sorry, let me just remove these pop-up messages. That I find interesting is that we decide when these certificates need to be sent out by a machine learning model. So depending on the request, depending on the number of cars around, we decide whether we should send the certificate or not. And it turns out that our model is, I think, has a correctness from 91% or something. And so this can be used to free up bandwidth to then use it for the higher post-quantum sizes. All right, but this was just a little detour to tell you how this can be optimized on a different level than the cryptographic level. If we go back to the constraints on the cryptography, we see that the bottleneck is that the cars need to react in a very short time. That means the BSM transmission must be in milliseconds. Also, the verification time must be in milliseconds. And to achieve that, we need to restrict the frame size to 2,304 bytes. And so coming back to the steps of the migration, it is really important when you try to tackle such a protocol to upgrade it to post-quantum security, to really understand the application's requirements and understand what you're working with, right? What kind of parameters are you working with? All right. So now it's the question, can we just switch this out? Can we just switch out ECDSA with post-quantum or hybrid signatures? And by the way, how I phrase it, you can guess, no, that's actually not possible. It's a little bit more complicated. What you can see in this diagram are the 3 candidates selected by NIST for standardization, the lithium, Falcon, and Things, and also XMSS, which is also a scheme that is recommended by NIST. And although Falcon has rather small public key and signature sizes, still it's just a little bit too large. So it's just a little bit above this threshold of 2,304 bytes. That means the straightforward replacement just won't work. And so that's kind of the next step. Ideally, we would just want to switch it out and all is good, right? But if that's not the case, then we need to tailor our extension to really the protocol. And to do that, or how we were able to.
I have a question.
Sure.
It's
yeah,
fine.
absolutely.
Yeah. So can you remind us where's this like upper bound on the 2,304 bytes coming?
So that's a that's coming from the IEEE standard. And this is a restriction on the frame size of each of the packages that is sent. And this frame size or this restriction is there to ensure that, because we have a limited bandwidth. So this is coming from the standard specification.
But it's like one way to look at it a little bit in that sense, like it was tailored to like pre-quantum settings, and in pre-quantum settings this like bound was like super like good, like I mean there was a lot of space, and now like in the post-quantum setting this bound is a bit too tight. But like I don't know how I want to say it, but like is it like a design problem also, or is there also physical bound, like cars can just not send significantly more than this in that time?
So the package size does impact the transmission time, so how fast this can be transmitted, and this is a safety issue, right? If a packet is taking too long, the car might not react in time. So this is how this bound. So it is somehow, in some sense, an artificial bound that was just decided on, I agree, and it was fine because it was designed for ECDSA, but there are actually reasons for that. And one is the transmission time, that it's just taking too long. And the other is also package loss. So if packages are too large, it's more likely that they are getting lost. So these two kind of motivate this threshold of 2,304 bytes.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So what I was moving towards is that now we are trying to design a protocol that that satisfies these constraints, also just for the reasons that that I explained for the transmission time and so on and so forth, but also so we have as little change to the standard as possible. So we try to design a scheme that can already be used now, because the transition to post-quantum is kind of starting already. And so one first step that we did was to analyze the attack vector of a quantum adversary. So what do I mean with that? Essentially, I mean, where is data open, where is data around, and can actually be exploited by a quantum adversary. And so I would like to remind you that these pseudonym certificates with the ECDSA key, they're valid for 1 week, but they are changed every 5 minutes. So, and it would need a very powerful quantum computer to be able to then compute the secret key within these 5 minutes where it is rotated at the moment. So we said maybe for the transit, and I would like to emphasize that. So I'm not saying we should use this forever. I'm saying for the transition phase until also vehicle to vehicle hardware has catched up, maybe there was a decision to change the standard. Until this happens, we say, okay, maybe the BSM signatures themselves, they don't need to be post-quantum. It's enough when they are ECDSA. However, the CA's public secret key pair, they are around long enough to be vulnerable to quantum attacks. So the integrity of these ECDSA keys, they must be protected by ECDSA and also post-quantum. And so we say it is enough to protect the integrity, as long also together we decrease the certificate validity period from 1 week to a shorter time, for example, a day. How would this protocol look like then? So this is a simplified pseudocode. I will walk you through this. And the first step is that we hash the certificate so we don't need to communicate always the entire certificate, but within these 5 message cycle that I mentioned before, we can only communicate the hash at some point to save against space. How does the certificate look like? Something that is very important when we look at these hybrid schemes. So here, different things come together, right? What we look at the hybrid schemes is that we want to avoid duplication. So what we did is that we defined a new certificate, so to say, that compresses this information. So we have all the information that we had before from the ECDSA certificate. And here in blue, you can see the values that we changed to make it this new post-quantum or hybrid certificate. That means we do change the duration of the validity, or we change the validity period. We add an identifier for the post-quantum algorithm. And of course, we also add the post-quantum signature. However, you can see that both signatures are over the same message. And this is over this certificate, which only has essentially the ECDSA key here. Now, strictly speaking, this is a so-called implicit certificate, so it only has a reconstruction value. I will not elaborate on that, but I'm happy to do so in the Q&A. The point is that you have post-quantum ECDSA signature only over the ECDSA key. Since the certificate did get larger, we will fragment it and then send fragments of the certificate with the BSMs within this 5 message cycle. Right, we have the fragments, we have the ECDSA signatures, and then if the receiver has the certificate already present from a previous 5 message cycle, for example, then the receiver can go ahead and immediately process these BSMs. Otherwise, it needs to store them and delays the processing until it receives all certificate fragments. And then once it receives these fragments, it can then process all the previous BSMs that it stored before. Now, this delay is not something that we introduced, but it is already specified. And so there is a delay allowed. But of course, we don't want this delay to be too big. And so now it's the question, is this delay small enough to be a viable solution for this vehicle-to-vehicle application? And so we have different viability criteria for V2V. I will read them out loud now, and then I will go through step by step. So one, for example, is whether there's actually sufficient certificate can we generate the increased number of certificates sufficiently fast, for example. Have we achieved our security goals? Of course, this is always one of the things that we have to check. Is the certificate distribution via the peers, is this fast enough? Is there acceptable delay of the messages? Is the size of all the frames below this threshold from the standard of 2,304 bytes? Is verification fast enough? What is the system capacity? System capacity is how many vehicles can be supported in the system at a time. So how big can the traffic jam become until vehicles cannot verify messages in time anymore, verify signatures in time anymore? And also, is there an acceptable transmission time? And so the first and the most important one is, of course, the one with the security goals. However, I will skim over this, but I will explain what we did. So we did define this threat model with also the powers of the quantum adversary carefully. And then we also defined a security notion for vehicle-to-vehicle protocols based on other definition based in the literature, of course. And then we provide a security reduction to the unforgeability of the underlying signatures and hash functions. Let's come to the experimental evaluation. So the easiest one is probably when we instantiate this partially hybrid scheme with the signature algorithms, can we make it so that the frame sizes are all below this 2,300 byte threshold? And yes, indeed, we can. Although, for example, for things, since the certificate is so big, we actually have to fragment it into four messages. That means just from the 5th message on, the BSMs can actually be processed. Before that, the receiver is still waiting for the certificate fragments to arrive. However, Falcon, for example, the certificate does fit in one frame, so it's similar to ECDSA. This also leads to whether we can distribute these certificates via the peer-to-peer distribution fast enough. And then, so how this works is that the receiver who does not have a certificate requests the certificate. So it sends with their next BSM, it sends out a learning request. And then the other cards respond with the certificates or with the fragments, right? And that means for Falcon, for example, it needs, because the Falcon certificate is larger than the ECDSA, it needs one frame more than the ECDSA variant, for example, right? And here we can really see that with things, no, this does not probably work, right? Because we are sending out, it takes 10 frames, it takes 8 frames. This is almost a second. And this it seems it's not acceptable by the community. So things is kind of out for this reason. If we move on to the transmission time, so this is something that also educates how big the frame size can be, then we can see that the transmission time is after the first frame. For Falcon, for example, is very similar. This is not surprising since everything is signed just with ECDSA, right? And then if we move on to the verification, we can see that the lithium is approximately, in our experiments, as fast as ECDSA. Falcon is 300 times slower, but we deem it still acceptable. And the reason for this is that we are looking at the system capacity. So how many vehicles can be supported with this transmission times and with this verification time? So for example, based on the transmission time, ECDSA can support 165 vehicles at a time. So imagine you are in a traffic jam and there are 164 vehicles around you, then you are still able to verify all and react to all these messages. Falcon can support, or the Falcon Association can support 101 vehicles. And so we are lucky that we just got about the threshold, because in the community, it seems to supporting 100 cars is more or less a threshold that you should be able to hit. That means that the others, even also dilithium, are probably not viable solutions for this instantiation. And this is, although if we look at the verification, of course, dilithium can verify many more messages than Falcon, for example, but overall, Falcon can just support more cars. Moving on to the acceptable delay. So what we are comparing here is the delay of messages. So when can the receiver actually process all the incoming BSMs? And we compare ECDSA to the partially hybrid instantiation using Falcon. And what I would like to show you here is that the delay is probably fine. It is larger. The package loss is also larger when we just use the partially hybrid design. But then using the partially hybrid design together with this NI-aided way of deciding when to send the certificate, we can free up enough space that the delay is actually getting smaller, and also the package loss is getting smaller, so that it seems to be acceptable. All right, so moving on to the last point. And as you can see, I'm not able to shade this with a darker green, but just with a brighter yellow. And this is because we do have ideas how to resolve this, but we have not been able to implement them yet. So what is the issue here? Our solution is, in our opinion, only secure if we decrease the validity period of the pseudonym certificates from 1 week to 1 day or even shorter. But if we do that, then we need more certificates per week per car. And so for reasons I will just brush over, currently we need about 20 certificates per week, rotating every 5 minutes. But if we decrease this validity period to 1 day, we are already up to 160 certificates. And if we decrease it to a validity period of 2 hours, then we need more than 1,600 certificates a week. We could, in theory, we could decrease this up to 5 minutes, right? Because these public keys are only used for 5 minutes, and then the rotation starts. However, it seems with the current protocol and with the current technologies, and this is an open question how to resolve that, rotating certificates with a validity period from less than 1 hour is really difficult just to administer this rotation, just to keep track of what certificates needs to be rotated. And so this is for the transmission period. We say, okay, 2 hours is probably fine. And then we probably switch to purely post-quantum solutions anyway. Okay, so then 1,600 is of course much more than 20 per week and car. This is also, so how can we deal with that? So one approach is to use the butterfly key technique that is already in the specs. This works fine for ECDSA because you can reuse, or on elliptic curves, sorry, because you can reuse the keys for encryption and signature. And this is something that these advanced key technique kind of needs. And so we have a few pairings also in post-quantum. So for example, dilithium and Kyber rely on the same hardness assumption. So in principle, you can use the same verification key and the same encryption key. But this needs very careful tailoring. So a work by Barreto and al. Has used actually Q-Tesla and New Hope, which are two schemes that are very similar to dilithium and Kyber, and they use it and instantiated for that. But of course, we would need to see how would this work for Falcon and dilithium and the respective encryption schemes. But there's potential for that. And the other solution could be to use batch signing. Batch signing has been written up for TLS as an internet draft by Benjamin in 2020. It has been deprecated since then. But my colleagues and I kind of resurrected this idea and showed that this would be very helpful for many different post-quantum applications. And the idea here is not to sign every certificate by its own, but instead to store them in a Merkle tree and build up this Merkle and hash tree. And instead of signing every of this 1,680 certificates separately, just sign the root. And then the signature is the root signature and the path to the respective certificate. So this definitely decreases the cryptographic burden on the CA. However, it increases the signature by 290 bytes. And so probably there is a balance. How many certificates do you want to fit into one Merkle tree versus the size of the increase of the signature? However, it shows that for the fragmentation of Falcon, these extra 290 bytes would not make a difference because we anyway have to fragment a little bit. I explained this idea in more detail in a NIST seminar, and we also have a explainer video that we had a lot of fun with. I just linked them here in case you're interested in that. All right, so almost all of the viability criteria are somewhat greenish. So I'm ready for the summary now. Just to summarize the different steps in this post-quantum migration. So the first step is obviously decision, what protocol do you want to tackle? And in my opinion, this depends on the urgency of the entire system to migrate it. Then the second step is to understand the application's requirements and constraints, and to then be able to analyze where's the attack vector of the quantum adversary. And depending on whether a straightforward replacement or a ready-made solution fits or not, we need to tailor an extension, a post-quantum extension to the protocol or not. And then this is something that is very important, is to analyze whether the solution is actually viable or not. All right. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.